The question of how they would select a president was one of the toughest decisions that they had to make. The one thing that they most were concerned about was making sure that there was some way to create an independent executive. The simplest thing to do would have been to have provided that the president came out of the assembly, that Congress would have chosen. The idea was batted around, but it was understood that if you did that, that Congress would have a control over a president that did not preserve the sort of separation that was necessary. And they eventually came up with this odd creature of the Electoral College. And the original set of provisions also created a set of circumstances because they didn't envision the development of political parties where for the first couple of elections you ended up with this unfortunate set of circumstances where the president and the vice president were of opposing viewpoints. I refer to this as the skunk at the garden party problem, that you're elected to govern, and there you have as your successor and the person that's constitutional, your closest companion, somebody of the opposing political party. And so the 12th Amendment, I believe, was the one that was established to officially remedy this problem. But the Electoral College was created as a mechanism to provide a kind of independent form for choosing a president. They didn't want to allow the states to do this. That would have empowered the states too much. It would have deprived the president of their independence. And in some respect, although it was an odd creation, and although it's almost inevitably comes under criticism as being a sort of jerry-rigged provision of the Constitution, it's served us fairly well.
The Electoral College was designed for multiple reasons. Chief among them was to try to balance the power of individual states, or to limit the power of individual states to overwhelm the power of other states. And when you go into a voting booth, of course, you're not voting directly for a presidential candidate, you're voting for the electors of that presidential candidate. And in a basic way, that has remained. In reality, the ability of an individual to pick his or her president is stronger now than it ever has been. There have only been a few examples in modern history where the public will was defeated by the Electoral College. But in general terms, the system is fairly robust and as the framers intended. Of course, it's not always what the presidential candidates in a given year would have intended.
The 12th Amendment, to go back to that for just a second, the 12th Amendment, again, provided for basically tickets. President would select his own vice president, but it didn't really remedy the problem of the vice presidency because ticket balancing throughout the course of American history continued this problem of a skunk at the garden party. I mean, if you look at John Kennedy's administration, for example, I mean, there were a lot of people in Kennedy's administration who thought, oh gosh, we got to deal with Lyndon Johnson. There were people in Richard Nixon's administration who thought, hey, we don't want to have to deal with Spiro Agnew. I mean, what's tended to happen because of the ticket balancing necessities of electoral politics, presidents have chosen people who are within the rubric of their party, but are unlike them in just about every other way, as a way of sort of balancing the ticket.
Initially, there was no limit on the number of terms that a president could serve. George Washington, during his presidency, set the tone for this, set a precedent, non-binding precedent, that an individual should only serve 2 terms of office. Washington, as much as anyone, was skeptical of the British Crown, and what he did not want for his nation was someone to continuously serve through whether they were popular or because of some other negative dynamic, to be able to hold the office for a lengthy time. There was a real appreciation, particularly early on in the Republic, that turnover in offices had positive results. When you look at the early Congresses, people didn't serve for 40 or 50 years in Congress. They served short periods of time, and then they went home. the expectation was true for the president as well. Eventually, however, Franklin Roosevelt, because of multiple crises that were happening and his own effectiveness as president, was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms in office. And as a result of that, there was real worry, as well as real politicking that went on behind the scenes, that that type of behavior should be stopped, that presidents were now unwilling to just accept the precedent that President Washington set, and there needed to be constitutional reform in order to stop that.
The 22nd Amendment was adopted in the middle of the 20th century, primarily to get back at Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats. There was a sense that FDR had overstayed his welcome, and so there was an effort to limit the number of times a president can run. Of course, traditionally, presidents had kept to 2 terms in office. Franklin Roosevelt felt, because of the onset of World War II, that it was a bad idea for the American system constitutionally to change horses in midstream. The American electorate agreed with him and elected him to a 3rd term and subsequently to a 4th term. The Republicans didn't like that and so decided to put a cap on that. The irony of this, of course, is that it seems, based on the realities of American history, that it was probably Republicans who were punished more for that than Democrats. Subsequently, if you look at the people who followed Dwight Eisenhower and others, that the most likely candidates for extending into a 3rd term would have been Republicans rather than Democrats. The argument against that, I actually think, is somewhat compelling, and that is that by establishing a 2-term limit, effectively you create a lame duck situation for any president who is reelected. Now, clearly a president coming into a 2nd term, based on the buoyant lift of a reelection, which places him or maybe eventually her into a privileged position historically of being one of the few who have been reelected, does get a boost of energy going into a 2nd term. And so there's some things that can be done, but the reality is that pretty much after the 1st year of that 2nd term, that people understand that a president cannot, will not be running for reelection, will not be going before the American people again, will not have any coattails, so to speak, in Congress. And so it limits their ability to govern. Of course, we've gone through extended periods in American history where we've had only single-term presidents, and this has been a problem there. One thing I always like to point out to my students is that we're actually in an unusual historical era right now. When Barack Obama was reelected for his 2nd term, this was the 3rd president in a row to serve 2 terms. Do you know who what the previous experience of this was? You have to go all the way back to the Virginia dynasty of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. So even having a 2-term president is something that it's not historically anomalous, but by the same token, it's not something that you could expect to happen.